Hi, I'm Jada Monica Drew, and our special guest today is Ivan Canada, the Executive Director of NCCJ. Welcome, Ivan, to the Bloom Inclusion Concourse Set. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Thank you so much for joining us. I am particularly interested in hearing what you have to say because you work in inclusion every single day.
Yeah.
That's what you go to work to do. That's what you meet about. That's what you produce as a product. I also want to know a bit about your leadership. Okay. So let's just start there. Tell us about Ivan. Who are you? Where are you from? And how did you get into this work as I would say, an inclusion specialist?
An inclusion specialist. I should add that to my business cards. My name is Ivan, and I grew up in North Carolina, grew up in Greensboro. And I would say that I am a social change activist, a bridge builder, a do-gooder, all of those sort of labels like that I would use to describe myself. And how I got here is this work is really personal for me, as I assume for most people that really devote themselves to inclusion and equity work. It probably stems from a personal experience that they've had or personal identity. And so for me, I was a lot of times in spaces that one brown face sitting in a classroom of white kids. And so, I recognized how I was different at a very early age. And I realized some of the things that happened to me where I felt really included at times and the times where I didn't. Yeah. And those are things that just stay with you. And, when you're 10, 15 years old, you don't know what that means for your professional life. But those are experiences that stay with you. And then as you begin to get older, you figure out, what do I want to make of those? How do I want to think about, people who are 20 years younger than me, maybe for them to hopefully have different experiences in education settings or in family settings and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And given your experiences in being either the only person in the room or maybe blending in with others in the room, having that inclusive or exclusive experience, can you tell us about a time that you've experienced and now you have the power to change that for someone when you look back 20 years,
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say, when I think about the work specifically that my organization does with high school students, we are committed to activating change in young leaders for them to think about how they can make their school environments more inclusive. And so what that looks like a lot of times is they may come and start clubs and organizations. And so I always like to tell people when I was coming out as gay, that was in the early 90s. And this was before Will and Grace was on television. And my high school didn't have any kind of club that was focused on sort of inclusion for LGBTQ plus students at the time.
It wasn't even a plus.
Right. It wasn't even a plus at the time. We were only talking about gays and lesbians, and if you didn't fit in any of those categories, you weren't even looked at. And so when I think about that, I didn't have something like that during some formative times of my life. And that now, I'm not going to say that every school environment is perfect when it comes to that population, but there is a lot more visibility in students and even allies who are willing to step up and say, I'm going to start this club because I know there are students here that need to feel supported and valued in their school days.
Ally, that's a word that I'm hearing a lot. I'm hearing performative allyship versus genuine allyship. I'm not going to go into what I think about those two terms, but I will ask you to explain, just in a nutshell, in a tweet, what is an ally from your perspective?
I would say, number one, I think it's a journey. I don't think it's something that you can say that you are an ally and the work is done. It is something you're constantly doing. There's also action associated with that. And I think based off where people are in their own journeys around understanding whatever that population is or that group, their actions may vary. In the beginning, it may just be showing up, right? It may be some of the performative stuff, right? That we are thinking about.
Things that you can do.
Right. It may just be I'm just going to go to a protest and I'm going to make a sign. It could be I'm going to post something on my social media and that's it. And then I think through really genuine interactions and relationships with people that are part of that marginalized group that you're serving an allyship with, you're going to learn different ways that are probably going to be a little bit more intentional, a little bit deeper, and possibly have a larger impact. But I think that, a lot of times we get so focused on someone's not doing it the right way, right? Like, what is the right way?
What is it? It's a
Right.
journey, like you said. And
Right
when
way.
you're advocating for someone or a group of people, whether it's someone in your family, a friend, someone you might not have ever met, you don't always know what to do and how to do it. So I'm glad you said that and really laid out that there are varying levels to allyship.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yes.
What is your formula for effective and inclusive leadership specifically for your staff?
So inclusive leadership for the team at NCCJ. Number one, I would say get the best people you can and surround yourself with them. And I am very fortunate to have an amazing team, and I don't consider just the professional staff at NCCJ the team. I also consider our board of directors and our volunteers and all of that that make up that team. I also think it's really important to support people. And so I look at my role as the chief executive of the organization is to think, how am I supporting folks in their own professional development? And so a lot of that looks like, I really try to honor holding regular one-on-ones to be able to help problem solve with them, help them make sure that they've got an opportunity to have me as a thought partner in their work.
Let's stop there.
Okay.
One-on-ones. A lot of organizational leaders have been having one-on-ones for a while.
Yep.
What does your one-on-one look like in the amount of time, the frequency,
Yep.
and how do you start those meetings? Because I don't think everyone taps into that as a best practice. So how do you conduct your one-on-ones? What does it look like?
So my one-on-ones are actually individualized to the person that I am meeting with.
Very custom.
Yep. So they are custom to the individual. They are a partnership. So I do not create the agenda for our one-on-ones.
Okay.
So the team member comes and we have a shared doc and they say, here are the things that I would like to address. So we do their piece first. And then if I've got sort of like more than likely it's kind of like questions of things and updates that I may need to get from them or whatever, and we do that. And so that relationship through both of those activities are really focused on them in their current role. And I also, the thing that I try to do that I don't get the chance to do often, but I enjoy being able to do this, is when I need to take my management hat off and put on a coaching hat, right? So if I really do care about my team, there may be different pieces of advice that I may need to give at different periods of time. And I need to be very clear around what role am I playing in this? Am I your manager, or am I your professional coach that I really want to see you long-term, what you need to do? And
Do you communicate that differently?
Yeah, I will. They have been in meetings with me and they will know, I'll say, I'm putting on a coaching hat here for you right now.
And so you're really customizing how you talk to them, how you communicate with them in a partnership. And so when you say shared doc, that's like a Google document, or maybe shooting an email to say, this is what I want to talk about. They'll tell you what they want to talk about. And then you also coach them professionally, and not just a, give and take for the organization, but you want to make sure that they're constantly thinking about their long term. And sometimes their long term may or may not be with your organization.
Absolutely. And I think that is, again, it depends on the mindset that you look at leadership, and that I have to recognize I want good folks in the organization that are going to be able to learn and grow and be better people, that when they leave there, I will happily serve as a reference, help facilitate what needs to happen for that, and recognize, especially in a small organization like NCCJ, in terms of a career path, it looks very different than it would at like a Google or an IBM, where they've a very clear path, a lot of steps. And so we're sort of flat organization to some degree. And so thinking about, I can obviously come up with different ways of additional responsibility, title changes, all those sorts of things to keep people engaged for the long term within the organization. But I also have to be prepared that at some point the day is going to come that they've gotten what they need to from this organization, and that because of the work they've done in this organization, they have an amazing experience to go somewhere else and take what they've learned there and take that into another place.
And be an advocate still.
Right. And still, and
For
absolutely.
NCCJ.
Absolutely. So that's sort of how I set up one-on-ones for that. You know, it is, I think is something that I enjoy being able to do because as an executive, you sit in a lot of meetings, you're constantly not in the office. And so like it allows me to have a pulse also on their work and think about, you know, what are the barriers I need to be removing in order for them to be successful? Because I think, you know, going back to your original question of like, how do I look at inclusive leadership? Like that is a piece of that is making sure that people feel that they're challenged, that they're given opportunities, and that they have the spotlight to be able to talk about the work that they are doing. You know, so one of the things, we just had a board meeting not that long ago, and I really try to allow all of the staff to be able to present to the board. You know, and you've served on enough boards to know that's not always how that works in organizations, depending on what the approach that the executive have. Do they want their staff to be able to have interactions with the board? And so I think that that's really important. I think another thing around how I would look at inclusive leadership is really looking at the leadership model you're bringing. And so, you know, are you in this to help uplift and support leadership in everyone or only in yourself? You know, and so like thinking about how can you have shared power, shared decision making. You know, I think about one of the big things when I get to NCCJ that I've tried to do is really be transparent. You know, like that's a leadership trait, to be transparent.
Let's stop there.
Yeah.
Transparency. I get that question a lot. How can I be transparent as a leader and also make sure that there are very, very clear lines, especially when there's a solid hierarchy within an organization, there's a solid, you know, code of conduct, but people want their leaders to be transparent, and leaders want to. However, there are certain things you have to keep confidential.
Yep.
There are certain things you have to make sure stays within a even a certain schedule of announcements or things being made public. Tell us how you've managed to balance transparency while also sharing power. That's like a really good question. I just got to say, people don't want to know the answer. Here it is.
Well, and I'll say this, like, I don't know that it's ever going to be really perfect either, right? So I think there obviously are times that leaders have to make tough decisions. You know, we are in an age of COVID and, you know, budgets are being cut. You know, people are having to make tough decisions. But I think that even in having to make tough decisions in organizations, I think if you are able to be transparent with people along the way where you can be, they recognize, right? Like that at some point, the leader and whatever that leadership structure and however that's been laid out, that decision is going to be made. If that's a board decision, if that is something that the staff is making a recommendation to the board, but wherever there's an opportunity to include more voices and have them be a part of it, people just appreciate that. Like I remember when COVID started here for us, like, you know, we're hearing about nonprofits, like shrinking budgets, maybe having to cut staff, cut programming, all this kind of stuff. And, you know, I knew that even if people weren't bringing that up in a staff meeting or talking about it in the office, like that's something that's in people's minds, right? Like, is my job safe? You know, and so even if I'm able to say, look, here's our reality. I want you all to see our balance sheet. I want you to see what the board is looking at from our financial picture. And I want you to see this is like, we're in good shape. You know, it doesn't mean that you just get to sit back, right, and not do anything. But I want you to know like that, like the money issue in this moment will not be the thing. And people appreciated being able to know that. And I also think that because when they are a part of that, they're also willing to roll their sleeves up and really get innovative and think outside the box. And all of that stuff happened. All of that stuff happened with my team because of that. Because I think they felt a part of it.
And not just in the moment, but because you've built that culture within the organization.
Yep.
So they were ready, they've been trained, and you've been trained to have those types of conversations with them. Right. So transparency, what I'm hearing from you, isn't just telling everyone within your organization, whether it's the board or your staff or your constituents or clients, everything that's happening as it's happening, but communicating, especially when they're really involved in how a decision is going to impact them directly.
Exactly.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Thank you for that. So let's dig in more about NCCJ. So we've talked about staff, we've talked about your inclusive leadership. Tell us outside of Anytown. I know about Anytown. I know about the blog.
Everyone knows about Anytown.
I know about the Big Citation Award. But can you break down what is NCCJ, the local chapter here? What's the national NCCJ? And tell us what are the things that you all give to the community in your services?
Yeah, so NCCJ now, all of us, at one point we were connected through a national organization. And we were all affiliated regional chapters. And so that structure went away in 2005. And at that time, there were probably about 65 NCCJs around the country. And now we're down to, I think we've got about under 20, I'll say that. And so they're all over the country, from California to Miami to Buffalo, Cleveland. And so really it was almost survival of the fittest, honestly. You know, I think it was depending on at the time what the fundraising capacity of that local organization was, who was on the board, whether or not the community really had bought into the work of the organization. And so being a native of Greensboro, I always like to say Greensboro is a little different than a lot of other places. And that is the reason why NCCJ was able to still remain here in this community when so many others closed down.
Different how?
That Greensboro is different?
Yeah.
You know, there's something here. You know, I know you've spent enough time in Greensboro to know some of this. You're a graduate of Guilford College, one of the sort of social justice crown jewels of Greensboro, you know, being the birthplace of the civil rights movement. The fact that we have not one, but two HBCUs here in this community. We had a women's college. You know, we've got a very vibrant and active, before I was at NCCJ, I used to be the executive director for the Guilford Green Foundation, which is one of a handful of LGBT community foundations in the country. So sort of very thriving LGBT organization that has connections to be able to set up an endowment like that. You know, you look at how Greensboro was founded, that this was a place that Jewish families felt welcomed to come here and start companies like Cone Mills and that. And so the fact that our leadership here has always been a little diverse. I don't know that, you know, I wasn't around to talk about like how inclusive it was. But the fact that, like, you know, there was diversity in who was in leadership in this community. And because we had these sort of pockets of very different communities that were working together. You know, when you've got two HBCUs, you've got a lot of Black African-American folks here that are in political power and that have had, you know, seats at the table in some degree that in a lot of other communities may not have had in the same way. So all of that kind of stuff to me is what makes up some of the uniqueness that I think this area has had. And so
that's a good history lesson, especially for people who are tuning in who may be across the world in Australia. They may not know anything about, you know, Greensboro. I've only seen like the Greensboro 4.
Let's hope they've seen that.
That's so right. But there's a lot, even so much more that you haven't mentioned. So we're back to NCCJ in Greensboro, very special place. And
yeah, so we are now a separate standalone 501c3, and the remaining organizations may not be called NCCJs, they may be called other things. And we are very loosely connected through sort of a professional association called the National Federation for Just Communities. And we really get together once a year and to provide some connections and peer support and capacity building to the organizations, because obviously doing this work and raising money for this work and doing the work is very different than a lot of other nonprofits. And so that's sort of what the sort of national structure looks like. And then locally, for us as an organization, I'd like to talk about NCCJ really being a community building organization that's focused on how do we create more compassionate and just communities free of bias, bigotry, and racism. And so that is one of the largest missions that an organization could probably have, you know. And when you think about, you know, I prescribe to the theory that nonprofits really should exist to try to one day not be in existence.
I agree with that.
Like,
wholeheartedly.
you know, and so we have a really big mission. And I think that a lot of us can say in the current moment that we're in, we've got a long ways to go. And so the way that we approach this work is we try to do the work, and that work can happen with students in schools, students in community-based organizations, educators, organizations, the community at large. Okay. But when we think about our work and maybe what makes us different, and maybe is a little unique advantage in terms of different approaches, is we really are trying to be a wide and big tent for an inclusion and equity and diversity conversation. And so what we are wanting to do is we recognize that work needs to happen through sort of three areas. Number one, education. Right? And that's sort of the awareness. How are we getting people up to speed, getting them familiar with terms and concepts and theories and frameworks? The second thing is dialogue. And so that is, I think, a place that is very unique for us. And a lot of that has to do with the history of NCCJ. So NCCJ was founded as a religious interfaith tolerance organization. Okay. Our original name, if you spell out what NCCJ used to mean, it was the National Conference for Christians and Jews. And so it was started at the height in the late 20s, and there was a Catholic running for president. And there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment that was happening. Some eerie undertones of what has been happening in our recent future here, current future here. And so because of that, that is a hallmark of the work that we do, is that we believe in having people sitting down and having difficult conversations, having people step outside of their comfort zones with people that they don't know, and equipping them to do that. And then the third piece is thinking about some bit of advocacy or kind of personal change. And so that personal change can take the gamut of many different things, right? So maybe you're new to this conversation of inclusion and equity, and maybe it's like, I'm going to have another conversation with somebody else and bring them into that. And that's what my kind of personal commitment that I'm doing to this work. It could be, I sit in a position of influence and power, and I want to think about what can I do to possibly change policies, practices, procedures. It could be, any of that kind of gamut, or it could be something as simple as, I'm going to do more of this because I know that I've probably got some areas that I need to continue to work on.
Or that personal work.
Right, that more personal work. And
so education, awareness. So education within awareness.
Yep.
Then we have dialogue and advocacy.
Yep.
And advocacy, all three of them can lead to action.
Yes.
And some of that action I've seen in the work that you all have done in Anytown, as well as the faith tour, multi-faith tour, interfaith tour around the city. What other things do you all offer in programming that people who are listening can tap into?
So we have a little bit of the way that NCCJ has been structured in the past is a lot of our work has happened in school settings or organizations. And so those are through relationships that we have had to be able to work with middle school, high school students in schools around inclusion and anti-bullying kind of work. And so that work is not as easy for people to kind of plug into simply because of the mechanism that it has happened within school structures. One of the things that we have been doing of recent, because the moment feels so different, is thinking about how we provide more community programming for people to be a part of the work. And so when we think about some of the ways that the current pandemic really uprooted the work in so many places, is that we moved some programming to virtual spaces. And so when we did that, that really allowed more people to have access to our work and to a community of people who care about inclusion, that really want to dig in these issues in a way that before COVID, we weren't doing as much of that.
Yeah.
And
what's the recent program?
And so that program has been focused on helping people understand kind of the current moment that we're in. So unpacking like why some people are maybe beginning to wake up to the fact that there is systemic racism and why some people have known that for many, many years. Right? And so one of the things around NCCJ's work that is really paramount is looking at our identities and how our identities are shaping the way that we are perceiving what is going on, right? And so if we recognize that folks that have had the lived experience of being Black and brown in this country, that they have been vastly aware of the inequities and the realities. But for folks that maybe haven't been as close in community, and don't have some of those relationships, this may be the moment where they're waking up to begin to figure out what is going on and thinking about what does allyship for them look like, or what does their own learning need to look like in this moment.
Ivan, thank you so much for sharing not only best practices for people who are moving toward more inclusivity and innovation in their organizations, but you really shared a bit about your leadership and a bit about yourself. So thank you so much for joining us today.
This has been a joy. Thanks for inviting me, Jada.
You're welcome.